The lights were blinding, the roar of the crowd deafening, and inside the octagon stood a man who looked like he'd been sculpted by a comic book artist. Broad shoulders, boulder, sized traps, and a glare that could cut glass. Alistair Overeem wasn't just a heavyweight, he was a walking nightmare. And on that night in 2011, across from him stood Brock Lesnar, a beast in his own right. But in just a few brutal minutes, Overeem would make Lesnar look human. One perfectly timed liver kick, deep, sharp, and devastating, folded the former champion like paper. Lesnar crumpled, the arena exploded, and Overeem stood over him as if to say, "Who's next?" It felt like the arrival of an unstoppable final boss. But the thing about monsters is that they always have a weakness. The whispers started as soon as the smoke cleared. It wasn't just that Overeem was winning, it was how he looked doing it. This wasn't the lean, rangy light heavyweight from his Pride days. Somewhere between 2007 and now, his body had transformed into something almost surreal. His neck had thickened, his arms looked like they'd been forged from steel, and his traps seemed to rise up toward his ears like armor plating. The fans had a name for it, Ubereem, but behind the memes and admiration was an uneasy question. Could a transformation like that really happen naturally? Then came the test. The Nevada State Athletic Commission called for a random check, just weeks before his highly anticipated title fight against Junior Dos Santos. And when the numbers came back, they didn't just raise eyebrows, they detonated a bomb in the heavyweight division. A testosterone to testosterone ratio of 14:1, 14 times the normal level. The headlines hit like a knockout punch. The title fight was gone. The suspension was official. Dana White was livid. Fans were ruthless. And in the blink of an eye, the monster had become the villain. But the suspension wasn't just a professional setback, it was a psychological gut punch. Overeem's entire aura was built on fear, dominance, and the image of invincibility. When the drug testing tightened and the ban took hold, everything began to change. The 260-pound statue-like figure started to shrink. The shredded frame softened, the bulging muscle mass began to fade, and when he returned to the cage, the difference was impossible to ignore. Fans noticed. Fighters noticed. The mystique was gone before the first punch was thrown, and without the armor, the battles became brutal. Overeem still had skilled lethal knees, precise kicks, high-level striking, but something was missing. Every time he stepped in, it felt like a test of whether he could still survive without the edge people now believed he'd once had. The psychological shift was massive. Opponents no longer walked into the cage fearing him, they walked in thinking, "I can beat this guy." And when the predator becomes the prey, the dynamic changes forever. The hits came hard and often. In his comeback fights, he absorbed punishment that would have been unthinkable in his prime. Bigfoot Silva weathered the early storm, then unleashed a barrage that left Overeem unconscious against the fence. Travis Brown absorbed his body shots, then planted a front kick on his chin that sent him crashing down. And years later, Francis Ngannou, a new, younger monster, launched a single uppercut that didn't just end the fight. It became one of the most replayed knockouts in UFC history. Overeem's head snapped back violently, his body stiffened midair, and he fell like a statue being toppled. It wasn't just defeat, it was a career-defining image of destruction. The irony was cruel. The man who had once been the most terrifying striker in the heavyweight division was now on the wrong side of highlight reels. Each knockout wasn't just a loss, it was a viral moment. Social media clipped and replayed them endlessly. His name trended, not because he was winning, but because of how brutally he was losing. The psychological weight of that kind of attention is something few fighters can survive. Every time he walked to the cage, he knew one bad shot could make him a meme again. For the fans, This was the great unraveling. For Overeem, it was a slow public execution of his identity. The suspension had cracked the shell. The losses smashed it to pieces. In a sport where legends are built on moments, his moments now served as cautionary tales. The once untouchable Ubereem had become proof of what happens when the lights are brightest. The rules change and the edge is stripped away. But perhaps the cruelest twist wasn't the losses, the shrinking frame, or the mocking memes. It was the realization that the image he'd spent years building, the monster who destroyed legends, the heavyweight final boss, was now impossible to rebuild. The sport had moved on. New names filled the headlines, and Overeem, one of the most decorated heavyweights in history, was left fighting not for belts or glory, but simply to prove that he still belonged. And yet, there's something about Overeem's fall that keeps fans talking. Maybe it's the drama of seeing a king dethroned. Maybe it's the fascination with how fast dominance can disappear in MMA. Or maybe, deep down, fans saw something in him they didn't expect, of vulnerability. A reminder that even the most terrifying fighters are still human. Because in the end, the story of Alistair Overeem's transformation from monster to meme isn't just about failed tests or brutal knockouts. It's about the fragility of greatness, about how quickly the sport can turn on you, about how the same crowd that once roared your name can just as quickly laugh at your fall. And maybe that's why his story still resonates. Not because of the titles or the wins or even the scandals, but because in his rise and fall, you see the full, unfiltered truth of fighting. The glory, the humiliation, the fear, the fleeting nature of dominance, and the haunting reality that in this game, no one stays the monster forever. The MMA world still debates his legacy. Was he one of the most gifted heavyweights of all time, or just the most enhanced? Was his dominance built on skill or on science? And perhaps the real question, if the Overeem of 2011 had never been caught, would anyone have been able to stop him? The sport has its answers. The fans have theirs. But the truth, that's something only Overeem knows, and he's not telling. It happened in slow motion, and yet in a flash. Francis Ngannou's fist arced upward like a wrecking ball, catching Alistair Overeem clean on the chin. His head snapped back so violently that it looked like a glitch in reality. His body stiffened midair, and then, thud, silence, then chaos. The crowd at UFC 218 roared like they had just witnessed a crime. The replay hit screens in the arena, and you could almost hear a collective wince ripple through the fans. It wasn't just a knockout, it was a public execution. And in that moment, the aura Overeem had been fighting to rebuild for years was shattered into a million pieces. But to understand how brutal this fall was, you need to know who Overeem had been. Once, fighters avoided his name on the bout sheet like it was a death sentence. He was the man who could finish you with a knee to the liver, a short hook, or a head kick you never saw coming. He didn't just beat opponents, he humiliated them, but post-suspension the mystique had cracks, the muscle mass had faded, the whispers about his chin got louder, and yet Overeem believed he could climb back to the top. He wasn't chasing memes or proving the critics wrong. He was chasing gold. The first real crack came against Bigfoot Silva in 2013. Overeem dominated the first 2 rounds, picking Bigfoot apart with precision strikes. But in the third, Silva unleashed a storm. Heavy hands smashed into Overeem's guard and then past it. A massive right hand landed flush, wobbling him, and Bigfoot went berserk. Hooks, uppercuts, overhands, each one echoing through the arena. Overeem crumbled against the cage. The referee dove in, but the damage was done. The once invincible striker had been hunted down. Then came the night against Travis Brown. Overeem opened strong again, working the body like a surgeon. each shot designed to sap Brown's will. But Brown's poker face hid the trap. Midway through the first, Overeem pressed forward, smelling blood. That's when Brown launched it. A perfectly timed front kick straight to the chin. Overeem's head jolted back, his knees buckled, and before he could recover, Brown pounced. Another finish. Another night where the predator became the prey. These weren't normal losses. They weren't decisions or grinding wars. They were violent, highlight reel endings that looped endlessly on social media. Every replay chipped away at Overeem's intimidation factor. Fighters who once feared him now saw a blueprint. Test his chin, weather the storm, and you could walk away with a career-defining win. By the time he faced Francis Ngannou, the stakes weren't just about rankings. They were about relevance. Ngannou was a rising monster, all raw power and scary precision. The UFC was building him as the future. Overeem was the gatekeeper, the man you had to beat to prove you were ready for the elite. But in 102 seconds, Ngannou didn't just beat him, he erased him. That uppercut wasn't just a punch. It was a viral moment burned into MMA history. The clip exploded online. GIFs, slow-motion edits, even memes with captions like "Thou shall not pass." For Overeem, it was humiliation on a global scale. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Every fight after, you know the clip is still out there. Every stare down, your opponent has seen it. They've studied the angle, the timing, the way your body folded. They don't fear you anymore. They smell opportunity. Overeem wasn't the guy you avoided anymore. He was the guy you beat to get noticed. And in a sport this brutal, once that narrative takes hold, it's almost impossible to shake. But here's the thing, Overeem didn't quit. He could have walked away after Bigfoot, after Brown, after Ngannou turned him into a meme, but he kept showing up. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was that deep, unshakable belief that he could still be the man he once was. And sometimes he did win. Sometimes the old magic flashed sharp combinations, vicious knees, calculated violence. But even in victory, there was a shadow. One clean shot, and the nightmare could return. And the fans, they were split. Some respected the resilience, the willingness to step back in against the scariest men alive after those losses. Others saw it as stubborn denial, a slow march toward more knockouts, more replays, more pain. Every fight was a gamble, not just with rankings, but with legacy. The hardest part to watch wasn't the physical decline. It was the shift in energy. The walkouts didn't carry the same menace. The stare downs didn't have the same edge. The crowd's reaction changed, from awe to hope to morbid curiosity. People weren't asking, who's Overeem going to destroy, anymore. They were asking, can he survive this one? And that's the cruelest transformation a fighter can go through, to go from feared predator to vulnerable target, to know that every mistake could be replayed 1,000,000 times before you even leave the arena. Overeem fought to rewrite that story, but in combat sports, some images are too powerful to erase. The Ngannou uppercut, the Brown front kick, the Bigfoot blitz. They became part of his identity whether he liked it or not. Still, there's something undeniably human about his refusal to disappear. In a sport where fighters vanish after a single brutal loss, Overeem absorbed defeat after defeat and came back for more. Not for easy fights, not for hand-picked opponents, but for the biggest challenges the UFC could throw at him. And in that sense, maybe the chin wasn't the only thing being tested. Maybe it was his will, his pride, his belief in himself when the world doubted. Because the truth is, every fighter gets old, every chin eventually cracks, but not every fighter has the courage to keep walking into the fire, knowing how hot it burns. Overeem did, and whether you see that as stubbornness or bravery depends on which side of the cage you're standing on. the MMA world still debates it. Was Overeem a fading legend refusing to accept reality? Or was he a warrior who embodied the spirit of fighting, risking everything, even his pride, to keep chasing the dream? Maybe it's both. But one thing's for sure, those knockouts didn't just change his career. They changed the way we remember him. And now the question is for you. When you think of Alistair Overeem, do you remember the monster who crushed Brock Lesnar? Or the man lying flat after Ngannou's uppercut? The sport has its answer. The fans have theirs. What's yours? For a man who conquered Pride, Strikeforce, K1, and the UFC, who flattened legends and wore gold on 3 continents, Alistair Overeem's final chapter came with no crowd, no tears, and no farewell. After his 2021 loss to Alexander Volkov, he was quietly released. No retirement fight, no in-cage send-off, no Hall of Fame spotlight. His name simply vanished from the rankings as if the Demolition Man had never been there. Even his return to Glory Kickboxing, a gritty win meant to close the book on his own terms, was erased after another failed test, stripping away his last shot at a storybook ending. Now, Ubereem lives in the Netherlands, far from the cameras, speaking about faith and redemption, while the sport he bled for rarely says his name. Some fans see wisdom in the retreat, a warrior finally laying down his sword. Others see tragedy in the silence. He's a king without a crown, a warrior without a war. And maybe the toughest truth is this: when the lights went out, most of the world wasn't watching. Did MMA forget one of its most decorated heavyweights? Or did the Demolition Man choose to be forgotten?